In this video, I'm going to show you what Claude Routines are. I'm going to show you how to build basic routines which work 24/7, even when your computer's off. I'm then going to show you something which nobody's talking about, and that's how to chain routines together for a genuine agentic experience. I'll give you some examples of what you could do, and then finally, I'll talk you through how to decide what you and your business should actually use them for. If you're new to this channel, then I'm Jamie. I've been building and delivering AI and agentic solutions for the past few years and work across the spectrum of AI, from understanding the latest technology to implementing it and scaling it. If you want to know more about how to actually use AI, then click the subscribe button below and you'll get my latest updates. So first of all, what are Claude routines? In a basic sense, a routine is simply an agent that is attached to a trigger of some sort. Now, it could be a schedule, such as a date and time, it could be an API, or it could be GitHub. In this video, I'm not really going to focus on GitHub because I think if you're technically savvy enough to understand GitHub and work with GitHub, you've probably already been using Claude Code in the command line interface. And if you've been using it in the CLI already, then the chances are you probably already know about cron and you may even have your own VPS. But if you really want to use GitHub, it's fairly basic and it is all in the instructions on Claude's website. It isn't just simply triggering an agent, because you can connect your agents to tools. And Anthropic calls them connectors, and then that's the official ones. That's the ones that Anthropic have already built two-way connections to. But you can also connect anything that has an API, as long as you understand the API documentation in your app that you want to connect, and you understand the Claude documents on the Claude page. Work with the two, and you can connect a non-official connector as well. And I'll go into showing you how to do that later in the video. But for now, just note that things like Calendly, your Google Suite, Slack, Airtable, ClickUp, all these kind of third-party apps. There are loads of others. I've just picked out some that are really obvious here. And so a really simple flow might be something like a daily email summary. So we might say something like, every day at 9 a.m, I want Claude to go to my emails, collect all my emails, and then summarize them, and then return them back into Claude in a nice summary. Now, before we dive straight in to talking about how to build a routine, I just want to talk a little bit about what an agent actually is, because it's not complicated, but I think it helps to ground our understanding of how to build out these processes. And I've taken this picture here from Claude's website, and just to remind, the agents are basically LLMs with tools in a loop, and that's basically it. We do have environments and we do have a system prompt to get us started. And this is an example of how it works. So you take your prompt, which might be the information on a daily basis. So if we use the email example, then it would be the new emails that you've received in the last day. Claude then evaluates, and a point here is that you would have a system prompt that is also added into the Claude so that the agent knows what's happening. I don't know why they haven't included that here in the example. I suppose maybe it's unnecessary. The tool call then goes out to Gmail, brings back the answers. Claude then evaluates. It could then make other tool calls, come back and evaluate, further tool calls, evaluate. So this could be, for example, getting each email one at a time. It doesn't have to be always the same tools. And then once it's finished evaluating, it then produces an answer. And that's really all an agent is. So to think of it in those simple terms, it's very helpful as we move forward. So if we wanted to do this, there are 3 different ways we can go about doing this. Number 1 is from the command line interface. I'm not going to go over that today. If you want to do CLI, I think it's fairly self-intuitive. If you've been using Claude Code on CLI already, you'll be very familiar with the process. And if you're unsure, then again, refer back to the docs. But the other 2 methods I am going to cover today, one is on the website itself, and the second is in the desktop app. There are some slight differences between the two, although I have noticed over the last few days of using routines that Anthropic themselves have actually been ironing and smoothing out those differences. One of the biggest differences, though, is where the process will run. If you create a process on Claude's website, then the process will always run on Claude servers in the cloud, which means that you don't have to worry about your computer. If you work from the desktop app, you have 2 choices. You can either run it from the cloud or you can run it from your own desktop. The desktop is beneficial because it allows you to do more things on your desktop and from your computer itself. So for example, if you wanted to run a daily tidy up of all your files, you can do that, but obviously your computer needs to be turned on and ready to do that. Conversely, if you're doing something like scanning your emails and creating a summary, you don't need your computer to be turned on, and actually, oftentimes your computer might not be turned on at the time you want this to happen, so using the cloud makes sense. Conversely, however, connectors are primarily in the cloud, and I've noticed that on the desktop app, connectors aren't available. So that is something to trade off and bear in mind. I'm going to primarily focus on the cloud because I think that's where the most opportunity is for business and opportunity to implement for other people as well. So when you come to Claude.ai, simply on the left hand side here, you want to click on the code icon there, and that should open up a new window of Claude Code. And on the left hand side here, you can then see we've got routines up here. Click on routines, and then you can see I've actually already created 4 routines, but if you didn't have a routine already, you can then choose up here, new routine. So if you click new routine, you'll then see the options, and you've got name and then a description. So the description here is actually not really a description, but it's actually a system prompt. So it's what you want Claude to actually do. So for example, if we called it daily email summarizer, Z there for you Americans, and then you could give it an instruction like every day I want you to summarize my emails, and I'll show you one that I've created in a moment. I actually ran this already, but my camera died, so I'm doing it all again. Then we've got down here, we've got select a repository. Now we're going to ignore this because we're not using GitHub, and over here we've got the default environment. So we'll quickly dive in here and just show you that you've got at the moment only one default environment, and you can add different environments. But let's go and have a look at the settings on what an environment involves by clicking on the cog here, and you can see how we can change the name. And then we've got network access. If you wanted, for example, your routine to not have any access to the internet, you can set that here. Or for example, if it was download packages from verified sources, so that might be installations for a script that you're using, or you can give it full unrestricted access, or conversely, you can allow it just custom domains. So for example, just Facebook, but not X, or however you want to set it up for your app. And this is probably in the more advanced section, but I just want to cover it now whilst I mention it. Environment variables, these are kind of like computer passwords. These would be things like API keys if they needed to be stored in here rather than in Claude's connectors. But again, not going to cover a huge amount of that now, but just to be aware that they do exist. And then you've got a setup script. So for example, if you wanted Claude to do something a little bit techie, you could create a setup script here. And then every time this instant runs, it will run as a routine at the time you've told it to run, or on an API trigger, and it will install whatever it needs to install first, and then it will continue on to actually running the task that you've told it to do. Now, I mentioned triggers in the previous screen. Here is the option to choose triggers, and again, you've got the 3 that I mentioned. So you've got on a schedule, this is time and date, GitHub, which we're going to ignore, and then on an API trigger, which we will come back to later. So if we go into schedule, again, we can see we've got once, hourly, daily, weekdays, weekly, and custom, and the time if we're setting it to daily. Now in custom here, you can click and you can see that this is a cron expression. So if you're not familiar with cron, you can Google it and understand how it works. But here you can see 08 ***. That essentially means 0800 UTC, which is 0900 British Summer Time. So going back to the daily, we will just leave it at 9 o'clock every day, and we'll add that trigger. And then the final thing is connectors. So we've got all these different connectors that I've already got added to my Claude account. However, by default, it adds every single connector to every single routine, which I wouldn't advise. So if you don't need them, then I'd remove them. It's called least privilege, and it's a very sensible process in technology. So we don't need Airtable, Calendly, ClickUp, Gamma. We do need Gmail. We don't want Google Calendar, Drive, or Slack yet. Now, if Gmail wasn't available for some reason, you haven't yet set it up, you can just come here and click Add Connector. So if we click Add Connector, you can see all the connectors that now I've cancelled, but you can add them back in if they're already here. If they're not, we can come through to Manage Connectors, and again you can see the list that I've already installed, and over here you can see the permissions, and you can then see when they do have permission. So always, ask, never, but don't worry too much about those for now. And then again we can click the plus button here, and you can choose to browse the connectors that already have been connected with Claude officially, or you can add your own custom one. So we'll go into browse connectors for now and see what's there. So let's say, for example, you wanted to connect HubSpot. You just click the plus button here, and then it would take you to the HubSpot website. You'd sign in, connect HubSpot back to Claude, and then HubSpot would be available in the list over here. However, I'm not going to create this routine because I have, as I said, already created it, and it's over here, daily email summary. And I've actually put it on pause for now. So let's go and have a look at this. And now I've opened up the daily email summary. This is the one I created before, and you can see that I've actually created a slightly more detailed instruction. So I've said I want it in 3 categories: action items, info only, and then emails which have no value. And then use emojis and whatever else, just to make it a bit more interesting. I've got just the one connector, which is Gmail, and that's all working fine. If we now go in and have a look at the run that I clicked earlier, so if you wanted to just run it now, you can click run now, but because I've just done it a minute ago, I'm going to just go back in and show you what I ran a minute ago. However, what you would see is that a new run would start here, and then it would start twirling around until it was completed. But let's go and have a look at the one I ran a minute ago. And the first thing to point out here is that you can see this is the prompt that's been put into the agent. And here we can see here a resume session. So it's resumed the cloud container. It hasn't refreshed the repository because we're not using Git. And then it started Claude Code. Then it's loaded the tools. And I'm not going to open that because there's quite a bit of sensitive information in there. And as you can see here, the output has output how I have asked it to. So it's got action items. And then further down here, we can see info only. And then at the very bottom, we've got no value email. So that really sums up the basic part of how Claude routines work. We take a trigger, we choose date and time or an API trigger. Claude then goes to a connector, or it can just run on its own. It doesn't necessarily need a connector. You could ask it the same question every single day and see how it answers it. But obviously there's not a huge amount of value there. The value here is in the connectors and getting Claude to do something with the information from the connectors. And then Claude outputs the information. Now, before we go any further, I'll just jump back over and show you on the desktop app that is basically almost the same. So here on the left-hand side, we've chosen to click into code, and then I've clicked onto routines here. And again, you can see here are the 4 different routines we've already got set up. And again, you can see that all 4 of these are remote, whereas we didn't have that remote icon on the web because everything has to be remote by default. We can actually come up here and choose new routine, and you get the option here to do a local instead of a remote. If you click on remote, we basically have the same setup that we already have in the cloud. Fine and easy. However, if you click new routine and you choose local, you'll notice we are missing the connectors. There are no connectors here, as I mentioned before. Strangely, there's an extra description box here, which means you've not only got to do a name and a description and then the system prompt. I'm not really sure why the extra description. It seems a bit overkill, but whatever. Also to note, so even if I give this a name like test routine, description, it's a test, and then a prompt could be tell me a joke, you'll notice here that it's still grayed out in create, even though we've got the frequency daily and 9 o'clock. The reason this is grayed out is because we need to select a folder with which this is going to work. And over here we've got permissions. Now this is saying at the moment it wants to ask us permissions before it's allowed to do any potentially destructive tasks within this folder that we're going to give it access to. So if I go to ask permissions, you can see here we've got the option to either ask permissions, accept edits, or go into plan mode. What's not available at the moment is bypass permissions or auto mode. And if you want to turn those on, then you need to come back into the settings, Claude. And on the left-hand side here, you need to choose Claude Code, and you need to actually choose allow bypass permissions here and allow auto permission mode here in order for those to be available. Do so at your own risk, blah, 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 blah. If you want a guest pass, please take that URL. So just to prove that the desktop and the website are more or less the same, if we go into the daily email summary and we click here, you can see that we've got the same prompt, and then if we go back, we can see we've got the 2 runs here, and we'll go into the first run again. And again, you can see that this is the prompt up here. It's continued the session as before, and then you've got the output here. And it's also worth noting that you can carry the conversation on as though it was a normal Claude conversation here by using the text box both in the desktop and the website app. Again, you can accept edits, and you can add attachments, and you can use voice, and you can even change the model, same as you would do in a normal chat. So that's all well and good, and that is the end of kind of the basic part of how Claude routines work. However, it isn't that valuable at this point. If we really want to get value from Claude routines, we need Claude routines to output to somewhere else. It's not really particularly valuable to just have that information sitting in Claude. And that's where connectors come back in again. So if we move now down to this intermediate flow here, what I've done is I've demonstrated that not only can you have a trigger that then grabs information and puts it into Claude, Claude can then continue that process on and use the connectors again, either the same or different connectors, to then pass the information it's now created. So think of the email summary. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we're going into Gmail, we're getting my emails. Claude's then going to summarize them, but instead of just keeping them there, it can either create me a message in Slack, or it could create me a new task in ClickUp. And I've mapped that out here in the simple flow. If we come back into our routines again, now we go back into our daily email summarizer. Let's have a look. If we go into edit again, you can see we've brought up the routine here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in one line which says, post the summary to my Slack by DMing me, and I've also included my Slack identifier there. Now, if you aren't sure how to get hold of your Slack ID, you click on your icon in the bottom left here. This brings up this tab here, and then you click the three dots here, and then you can copy your member ID. Next, we want to add a new connector, so we click here, and then we need to find Slack, and again, if Slack isn't already added, then you need to add it via this method here. And then we can click save. Again, we can click run now, but I won't do that because I've already done that run now here. And let's have a look at what happened. And good news, it loaded the tools. It did have a failure. I had a look at what the failure was. It was basically, it had an issue with one of the connectors and it then tried again and it succeeded. So not a massive drama. It looked at the inbox, created my summary, and then it has posted the Slack to the DM. And it even gives me a link to view the message. It also gave me a quick recap there. And let's go back to Slack now and have a look. So over in my DMs here, I can scroll down, and again, we've got an inbox summary with action items, information only, and then at the very bottom, emails with no value. And so now, not only have we got something happening which Claude can analyze and assess on a daily basis, it can now also send it wherever we want that data to be sent to. It doesn't have to be to you. It could be to a colleague, or it could be to a boss, it could be to a family member. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be Slack either. The point I was just raising here was that I'm using Slack as an example. It could as easily be Airtable, another email, or some other app like ClickUp to create you tasks. Really, it comes down to your imagination as to how you can best utilize this. Now, we've gone over a very basic flow, which was essentially on a time schedule, get my emails, and then review them and create a summary. We've then added on the connector that we can send it either to Slack or something like ClickUp if we wanted to. But what we can also do is on a different app doing something, that app can then trigger Claude to do something with the information that comes from this app, for example. So if, for example, we have a Fireflies, so this is Fireflies. Fireflies, if you're not familiar with it, is an app which you can install onto your Google Suite. I think it works with Zoom and other apps as well. There are many other different versions of this. I think Phantom is a similar one. And I think even now Google has its own proprietary one installed already inside, but it is essentially a virtual note taker. It will record the meeting that you're on. It will identify the different speakers by their tone of voice. It will identify action items and summarize the meeting. And it can then send all that information to you immediately on finishing that meeting via something called a webhook. Now you can set that up in Fireflies. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it here, but it is fairly simple. And if you just follow the guidance from the Fireflies documents, you can then get a webhook and then you can trigger the API in Claude, and then you could ask Claude to do something with that information. For example, you could say to Claude, take the action items from this Fireflies transcript and create me my to-do list in ClickUp. Very simple to do, pretty powerful. Conversely, if something in ClickUp happens, for example, I've completed a task, I then want Claude to do something. And again, Claude could then pass on that information. It could create emails, it could update colleagues, it could do whatever. But for now, let's go and have a look at ClickUp and let's see how we can do that. So back in routines here, I've created a new routine. And if we go and have a look at it, and we go to edit, you'll see that I've created a very simple routine. It's called ClickUp Task Complete. And on ClickUp Task Complete, I want it to tell me a joke. And what I've done here is I've used the call via API process. So if we click and have a look at call via API, you can see that there are two different things. First is the URL. This is like the address that it needs to go to. And second is the token. And the token is like the password to get into the house once you're at this address. Here you can see the example curl. Now curl is a kind of computer command. So if you have a look here, you'll see, and this is an example where it shows the whole URL, authorization bearer, and then the token, which is this value here. And then the rest of this is just useful information. And you can add additional text. For example, you might want to include the task that's been completed. Now if we go into ClickUp, and what I've done here is I've created a new little project in ClickUp called Demo for YouTube, and as simple as this, at the moment you can see here that the status is to do. And instead what we could do is we could update it to in progress. Now that is nothing has changed as yet, but what we can also do, you can come into the settings on the top right corner, and then on the left hand side you can click on Automations Manager. And you can add an automation. Now you can see here Demo for YouTube is already selected, which is good. And if we go on and add the automation, you can see we've got the choice of triggers. And what I've done here is I've just created a new trigger, which is for a task or a subtask when the status changes from in progress to complete. And we then select over here, we've then got the option here to call a webhook. So we can click here, and what you'll now see is that there is a pop-up for upgrade to business. Now, I'm not going to do that because I've actually got another app called N8N, which I use a lot for a lot of my automations, my basic non-AI related tech flows. However, if you don't have N8N and you want this sort of flow, then for $12 a month per person, it's probably worth it. But I'm a bit of a cheapskate and I don't really need to pay for that. So I've created a really simple flow, which is at the moment, when a ClickUp task updates, if the following things are true, so you can see here, if the before status is in progress and the after status is complete, then I want the flow to continue. And I've then set my API key values in here and then make a HTTP request to Anthropic to the trigger ID and using the API key. Now, if you want all of this, it's totally available for free. Drop the word guide in the comments below and I'll send you a link for all of this information so you don't have to do it all yourself from first principles if you want to use N8N. But as I say, you definitely don't need to. So back here now we're in status in progress. So now if we change in progress to complete, what should now happen is some magic in the back end and eventually we'll come through and you can see here today, we've just triggered it and all it's going to do is tell me a joke. So as soon as the ClickUp demo task was completed, it's told Claude to do something and here you go. Now we've got a joke. Now something I do want to call out here, and it is slightly odd behavior. I kind of know what's happening, but at the same time, I don't think it's been very well designed, is that in routines, if you come up here and you click the edit routine, so this is the one that we've got at the moment. Now our system prompt says, tell me a joke. Fine. But we know that when you use an API trigger, here's the example. So you can choose to add additional text. So this is context. So for example, if we go back to our information here, we could choose to add any of the fields that are already in here from ClickUp, or it could just even be the title. So the point is you can provide additional information. Now the way that I've done this to test it is in my N8N. This is the equivalent of ClickUp directly sending this. But what I've added here is a value of text where joke about elephants. So you can see here this value here, text. What I've added here is joke about elephants. And you can actually see it if you look at the example I've shown here. You can see what happens. So tell me a joke triggers first, and then immediately afterwards joke about elephants. Whereas what I think should really happen is that both of them should be brought together in the same prompt so that you have all the context for the AI agent and then it works. At the moment what happens is tell me a joke triggers and then it starts to tell me a joke. Then the understanding is that tell me a joke about elephants is then triggered. So I think it's a little bit clunky at the moment. It's not perfect, but I just wanted to call that behavior out because if that's something that's really important to you, I would probably add in this instruction here, I would say, tell me a joke about the following subject. Wait until you receive the topic before continuing. So I'd give it information to say you are getting more information and don't do anything yet. That will generally work. As I say, it's a bit clunky, but that is the reality of where we're at. So we've covered what Claude Routines are. We've had the reminder about what agents are specifically. We've talked about how to build a basic routine, and I've given you some examples of increasing complexity. Now I want to go on to talk about an advanced example and about chaining agents together, because I think this is where the real value lies. So this flow here looks a little bit more complicated, but what I would say is it's almost the same as everything we've already done. We started off with a trigger. We've then used some connector of some sort, and we've passed the information to Claude. And if we want to, Claude could then update one of the other connectors. Now I've added this on the left-hand side here, just to point out that we don't have to use the official connectors. We can also use the unofficial connectors, which at the moment aren't available directly through Claude. But this isn't really adding any complexity. It's just a different set of tools. These are broadly the same sort of thing. And in fact, you could, if you really wanted to, add many of these via API, via the unofficial methodology. But you don't need to. You're making your life more difficult than it needs to be. The real value is this very subtle green line here. Because what we're going to do is we are able, because we've got the APIs, is we can now take a trigger to make something happen, whether it's an API or a time date, which can then trigger Claude to do some analysis, to pass the information back into one of our connectors. But one of these connectors is also got the ability to pass information via API, which can then trigger the whole process off again so that we can do a different process. So it doesn't even have to be the same process in a loop over and over again. So for example, we could say every day at 9 a.m. get all of my emails from Gmail, process them and create a summary. Send the summary to Slack, but also send the summary to ClickUp. We could then say that when ClickUp creates a new task, trigger the API, and then we could have a different routine, which is now going to fire. So for every time we have a ClickUp task created, we might then say, go into Notion, get any information about the company that the task has just been created, and create me a detailed report about that company and send it to Slack. So now suddenly you're starting to chain together different flows for your business, and you can start to compound the value out. A very basic example that I've used is this flow here. This is for social media content generation, but even if you're not in social media content generation, the concept and the principles are what's important here, not the actual reality of creating new content. So for example, every day I want you to scan my emails. I want you to find all the newsletters, and I want you to convert them into a detailed summary of all the different topics from my newsletters. I then want you to store them in the Airtable, and then when that Airtable has a new record, that's going to trigger a different routine. This routine is going to create TikTok scripts around the different topics that are in the summary, and then add those to a different Airtable, and then I'm going to create them and send them off to TikTok. So let's have a look at how that works now in Claude and then in Airtable. So over here you can see this is the fourth routine that I've created. So if we click into write TikTok scripts, and you can see that at the moment actually I've got a lot of connectors connected. I probably don't need all of these. So actually if we go up into edit, I can reduce the amount of connectors needed. We don't need Calendly, don't need ClickUp, don't need Gam, and don't need Google Calendar either. So that's already made my app more secure. It's just less chance of this routine accidentally looking at or deleting or messing with data from anything else. Now, let's have a look at this routine. We've got here, name is write TikTok scripts, call it whatever you want, call it Bob, doesn't really matter. And I've said here, write TikTok scripts based on the attached summary. For each new script, create a new record in the Airtable view, and then I've given it the information here of the base, table, and view. Now don't worry too much about this, but I'll explain it more in a minute. So now what we've got over here in Claude is we've got two different routines. Firstly, we've got the daily email review routine, and then we've also got the write TikTok scripts routine. So these can fire independent of each other, and they don't necessarily have to run in the same flow. So to go back to our diagram here, this is going to be the daily email summary script, and this one's going to be the write TikTok routine. But just to compound my point, we could actually trigger this script daily at 7 a.m. Or we could also trigger it on the basis that other things happen. So ClickUp or Monday.com or any other things could happen that could also trigger this. So this can get triggered, and same for this one here. This one, it could be at 9 o'clock in the morning, but it could also be from a different API. There's lots of different ways and methodologies that we can do it, and they don't have to be linked together. And at any point, if we wanted to, we can just cancel this specific relationship here by just removing the API trigger. So we've got the two different routines. If we click into the daily email review first, let's go and have a look and edit it. So you can see here the connectors, we've only got Airtable and Gmail because they're the only ones that we need. We're going to get from Gmail and we're going to send to Airtable. And we'll start off with the top part of the flow. So get all my emails tagged with the newsletter tag. So just as a side point here, in my Gmail, I create filters which tag all my different emails in different ways. So if I know it's a newsletter, it's from a certain person, it's always a newsletter, it comes in every day, then what I do is I tag it with the newsletters tag in my Gmail. And that has certain rules on it. So for example, I might skip the inbox altogether and just put it in the newsletter folder. So what I'm saying here is if an email has been tagged with newsletters and it's been received in the past 24 hours, then find all the news topics and the articles covered in any of those emails. I want it to ignore the ads and sponsored links, which makes sense. And then I've said research each of the news items. Always try to identify the original source to confirm the information is true and accurate. And then compare any different takes and views from within the newsletters. So I kind of want to understand if there's one newsletter that's saying Claude's amazing, but another newsletter that's saying Claude's absolutely rubbish. I kind of want to understand which one I personally agree with, what's my take on it. Then create a detailed breakdown for each topic. And then I've said to save it in Airtable. Now, don't worry too much about this stuff, I'll go over it in a minute, but what I think is worth understanding is that we've got the table, which is called Claude Routine Manager, and then specifically we want the sheet called Email Summaries. So if we jump over to Airtable now, let's have a look at that. So here you go, you can see I've already started setting it up, and we're up here at the top. It's called Claude Routine Manager, and then this sheet is called Email Summaries, and that's exactly where all of these different records are going to go. And you can see here we've got name, summary, assignees, and status, and we have got the date created, but that's automated. So we've got 4 different columns, and we want Claude to create and populate those 4 columns each time we get a new daily email update. My instructions continue to say, save the breakdown in this Airtable, and I've given it the base ID there. And if you're not sure how to get that, you just go back into the URL, and you can see it's just this first part before the slash here. So there's a slash there, so we ignore everything after that slash. So that shows you that you want Claude Routine Manager, so that's like this spreadsheet if you like. And then the second part before the next slash, so there's another slash there and there's a slash there, so the middle one, that tells you you want this specific sheet and not any other sheets that are along the top. And then this final part here before the question mark is the view, so that is basically, it's the same sheet but you can have it in all kinds of different views, so you can hide certain things or whatever. Doesn't really matter about the view for this part of the prompt. So I've given it the if you like, the spreadsheet, and then I've given it this sort of this specific sheet itself, or the table as Airtable calls it. And then I've said to it to create a new record and fill in as follows. I've said for the name, I want today's date in that format, followed by the main topic. And then I've said for the summary, I want the summary that we've just created. And then finally, the assignee is going to be me. And again, I need my user ID. And then the status, I just want to set as to do. So fairly simple. Summarize the email, but now I want you to throw it into an Airtable for me. And as you can see, we've done that already. And Claude, and so here today, we've just had Anthropic Mythos breach. So let's have a look. And if we come to the top here, you can see we've got 5 different sources. And here are the main topics of conversation. So clearly the Mythos breach is obviously a topical one, and there's different takes. So it's provided me with a summary of all the information here that I can then read through and understand. It's created it for me, and it said it's got to be a to-do, which is exactly what I want. So that alone is a standalone routine, just like we've already created. It takes an input at a certain time and creates an output. And the output in this case is also sent to Airtable. But in Airtable, up at the top here, we can use automations, and we can say when a record is created. So if we have a look here, we can see that when a net record is created in email summaries, I then want to say if the status is to do, which obviously it is at the moment because we haven't done anything with it yet. If the status is to do, then we want to run a script. And this script here provides everything we need to be able to trigger an API call. So if we have a look here, we've got the URL for Anthropic, which is this one here. And then what I've kept separate is the actual routine parameter. So if we come back into routines, you can have a look here at the right TikTok scripts. So we now need to create the next routine. So if you haven't already created a routine, you'd need to do this now. I've already created this one, so I don't need to, but what's important is the call via API trigger here. So if we click on this, you can see this is the URL. And if we click copy, if I go back into Airtable, if I just paste this below, you can see here it now has the trigger attached just before the /fire. Make sure you remove that. So what I've done here is I've taken that trigger value and I've called it routine ID, and then I've added it here. And you can see that it does indeed match, which is good. I'm going to undo that because we don't need that there. And then also we've got the token value here. Now the token value you have to copy immediately. As soon as you lose it, then that's it. You have to regenerate. So let's say, for example, we have lost it. So just to go back here for a moment, you can see I've also created API key here, and this is the current API key value. And up here, I've added it in as params.api key. So when this triggers, they will then trigger. And as you can see here, I've triggered it in the past. We get a session ID, a URL, and everything has worked correctly, which is exactly what we want. Now, if we come back in here and we choose regenerate, look what happens. We've now got a completely different key. This is a one-time key, and we must copy it. We then need to paste it in our value. Otherwise, we won't be able to trigger these anymore. Now, obviously, just to point out, don't share API keys with anybody. I'm going to cancel all these API keys at the end of this demo, but I just wanted to show everyone that's how it works. So please don't try going and spamming this and creating me thousands of TikTok scripts, as much as I would absolutely love you to do that. So now we can click done. and we'll click done again. And of course, if you're not quite sure on how to do any of this, you can always ask Claude is the first option. Or of course, you can also go into the documentation around Airtable or Claude itself to understand better how to make these calls. And what I've now done, back in Airtable again, we can now come and you can see here we've got email summaries, but we've also got TikTok scripts. So if I click on TikTok scripts, you can see here we've got the first 10 that were created the other day. And then more recently, we have got, you can see we've got scripts that were created the other day, and then today you can see that a number of other scripts have also been created. And we can have a look here. So it's got a title, the script, the assignee, and the status. So if we go and have a look in this one here, you can see here that it says a random Discord group just breached Anthropic's most powerful AI on the day it launched. And that's a little TikTok script. It's probably not perfect, but that's not the point. The point again is to show you that we can now chain everything together and we can go from one thing to the next thing, all automatic, all in the cloud, all without your computer needing to be turned on. We've really covered all the examples I'm going to cover here. I don't want to go into any more detail because I don't think there's much more value. It's simply a case now of you going away and setting these up for yourself and having a go. But the final question, which I do want to talk about, is probably the most important question to actually consider, which most of the video tutorials that I see don't cover when it comes to working with Claude or any AI in general. And that is what to use this technology for. I'm going to indulge myself a little bit now, and I'm just going to talk about how I think we should be considering what to use these agentic tools for. So first of all, you may have seen this triangle before. It is something that I'm really passionate about and I really believe in. And I think particularly if you're delivering these solutions for clients, talking to your clients in this sort of way really helps them to understand that AI isn't some mythical thing. It's actually just the final step in a process which hopefully they've already been doing, but in my experience, oftentimes haven't. And that is that step one is all about creating processes and flows. Now, small companies generally don't even have their processes written down, so that if somebody else comes in to help, they don't even know where to start. Larger companies generally tend to have some kind of operations manual or processes or things generally written down somewhere. They might not be up to date, but they are written down somewhere. It's not in someone's head. But what they often haven't done is then automated those processes. And then finally, those companies that have automated, they are the ones that are in the right place for adding AI as a final solution. Because the considerations for agents that I think are worth considering, whether you're implementing this for yourself in your own business or whether you're implementing this on behalf of clients, is first and foremost, the golden rule of any agentic AI system is it revenue generating? We need things that are high value and low cost. There is no point in creating an agentic system for something that you do once or twice a year. You need something that you repeat on a frequent basis. And again, it brings you in a lot of value to your organization and it won't cost you a lot to actually implement this. Secondly, it's things that are non-discriminate. So what I mean by non-discriminate is something that when you put the question in, you don't want the exact same answer every single time, because that is the job of automations and code. Wherever possible, we want to use discriminate processes. So for example, if every time you put in blue, you want the number 3, that is a perfect example for a script, a piece of code. It's not the right thing for AI to do, because AI probably will get it right, but there is an element of statistical probability that means at some point it probably will get it wrong, which seems crazy, but that's the way that AI works. You don't want things where you always want exactly the same answer out based on the input in. When it comes down to the kind of the thinking process, that is the part that you want AI to focus on. And I definitely don't think it's a good idea to just blindly convert workflows that you already have, things like N8N or Make.com. If they're working well, definitely don't think about bringing AI in unless it's adding real additional value. Thirdly, I would argue at the moment with where agentic processes are that you don't want something that's customer facing. So in the examples I've given you, everything comes back to me. It's up to me to audit and review it. I don't send things off to the customer without first checking everything over, making sure it's all good to go, and then I will send it off. Same with TikTok scripts. I don't throw those TikTok scripts into something like HeyGen and just create a version of me saying whatever. I actually read through those scripts, I edit them, I record it myself, like I'm doing right now, and then, and only then, does it go out to customer facing. Fourth, non-business critical. At the moment, I would argue that most agentic systems are not good enough that you want to put your livelihood or your business's livelihood or your client's business's livelihood on the line for agentic systems. I would say you want to do it side by side with stuff that is important and, as I said, revenue generating, but not something that can set the barn on fire. Fifth is simple things. Now, there's a bit of a conflict here, there's a bit of a tension, because you want AI in some ways to do the complicated things, and that is right, but at the same time, you want to keep it as simple as possible for the agent. If you think about it, if you've got a PhD student and all you need them to do is something that a GCSE person could do, perfect. You know that they're almost certain to get that right every time. If, however, you're asking a PhD student to do something that's right at the edge of their abilities, there's a higher chance, it's harder work for them, it's also a higher chance that they'll get something wrong. Number 6 is test, test, test. Now, I actually drew that in this picture below here because I think it's really important that you test at every step of your business processes, because these things will go wrong, and you will find that as you evaluate and as you review each of your different agent outputs, you will find different problems and different challenges, and you'll have to train or tune your agents to get them to be just right. And even when they're tuned, there's still a very high chance that something will go wrong at some point. So do bear that in mind. But the more that you test them before you put them into production, the more likely you are to hone and refine the system prompt to reduce the chances of it doing errors, because you've already caught different errors. The more testing you can do, the more likely you are to get good output when you go into production. Next is kind of a back-end question, which is more about, is the data easily accessible, and how important it is to spend time on designing the flow or architecting. This is the unsexy work, but it's absolutely foundational to really good agentic workflow. If the data can be accessed and identified, if it's labeled and categorized, and it's exactly how your agent needs it to be, and it knows that every time it goes in to find data about a certain topic, it can find it in the right way, whether that's in a table, a database, emails that are tagged in the right way, it will be much easier for AI to get it right every time, rather than relying on AI to find the information despite the fact that data is bad. And then just 2 other points really I want to make here. Number 9 is that if you are technically minded, a VPS and cron will give you more, like 100%. One of the things I haven't really touched on yet is that if you look on the website, you'll see that you only get 15 flows per day to run on Claude's website. I think it's unlimited on the computer, as long as your computer's turned on. But if you want Claude's Cloud, you only get 15 included in your subscription. And I'm not even sure if it's less for those of you that are on Pro subscription rather than the Max. I haven't checked on that. And the final point is that you are putting your trust in Anthropic Stack entirely. So obviously you're trusting Claude in terms of its large language model. You're trusting Claude to not train on your data and not leak your data. But on top of that, you're now trusting that Claude's essentially virtual private server will run at the time you want it to run, or will always run when there's a webhook that's triggered, and that it won't fail. It is just an extra factor that you need to bear in mind. I think it's probably on balance worth it. It's much easier, certainly if you're not technically minded, it's probably the only option right now you've got to build some really impressive systems, but it is worth bearing in mind. That brings to a close this video today about Claude Routines. I hope you found it useful. If you want any extra help, then we have a free community on the school platform, and the link is in the description below this video. By all means, come along, join, get involved, and understand more about how you can make AI help you to scale and grow your business, make money, free up more time. Because if we're not doing that, we're doing something wrong.